Welcome to the Production Talk podcast with me, Yarn of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. Please subscribe and recommend this podcast to all your friends. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 40. Welcome back to the Production Talk podcast. Before we continue with part 2 of the interview with James Lyall, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that the following interview was recorded on, the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for tuning in again. Today is the second part of the interview with Mr. James Lyall, and we're changing the subject today away from all the technical aspects of MIDI, and we are talking about mixing, we're talking about the creative mindset, obstacles in mindsets, things that make it difficult to overcome. We talk about perfectionism, the good and the bad, and lots of amazing stuff. You will see there's something in there for everybody, and to me, a lot of it made so much sense. And James has got this amazing ability to put it into such simple words, and I just couldn't explain it any better. So I hope you are as excited as I am about the second part of the interview with Mr. James Lyall. Let's cut straight to the good stuff. Here it goes. Look, if that's okay with you, I'd like to change the subject a little bit and talk about mixdown. Look, mixdown is my special field. I do a lot of it, but it's mainly with music that has been recorded through microphones, acoustic instruments or sometimes electronic instruments, of course. But and what I find is that the traditional linear workflow of first recording it all and then editing it all, and only then you go into mixing and only then you go into mastering, these separate workflow steps or milestones, if you want to call it so, they are pretty much still alive in the productions that I usually deal with. But in EDM, it's quite different, isn't it? Because, mixing happens at any production stage, and the transitions are blended or blurred, if I may say so, a lot more. What difference does it make for you? Do you sometimes struggle to focus on one element? Can you really, put on your mixing hat and only focus on mixing without going back into editing notes?
It's a fantastic question. It's one that comes up a lot when I'm teaching. So for me, it's one of the struggles of working in the box as an electronic music producer is having to constantly, all the way throughout the production process, switch between one of two modes of operation, right? Now, we can get quite deep on this on a psychological level if you want.
Go for it.
Cool. So creativity and how the creative brain works is something that has been explored for many, many, many years now. One of my biggest influences on a creative level is John Cleese. Both because I'm a massive Monty Python fan from age whatever, when I started watching that stuff when I was a kid, but also because he released a phenomenal, it's not like an interview, it was like a workshop that he did for I think it was a Norwegian management company. It's on YouTube. Again, you can put this in your show notes. But basically it's a half an hour, 40 minutes discussion of creativity in management. But he really taps into a lot of very, very useful creative theories or ideas that will benefit anyone that's making anything creative. So one of the biggest things that he touches on is the fact that how basically when it came to trying to understand creativity on a deep psychological level, people kind of gave up trying to do it or trying to work out actually what creativity is. Because even after years and years and years of studies and research, it's very, very, very difficult to define what creativity is and where it comes from because it's so unique from person to person.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest concepts that he put across is this concept of working in one of two modes of operation when you're making things. Now, this could be ideating stuff. It could be, for example, trying to come up with a script for a movie. It could be trying to write a song. It could be producing a techno track in Ableton from start to finish. But basically, he states that your brain goes into one of two modes of operation all the way throughout this process, depending on what it is you're doing and how you're feeling. And he defines them as open and closed mode. So open mode is what he defines as the sort of creative space, the sort of creative headspace, where you're not really pressured by any external factors like time or, sort of anything that might sort of interfere with that creative process. You're not feeling stressed out. You're in almost like a blissful state of play. Yeah, almost like childlike is the way that he describes it.
Brainstorming would be one of those states.
Like brainstorming, yeah. So where you're not really focused on a set objective, you're just more sort of enjoying that process and just exploring and seeing what comes out. And that's usually me when I sit down to write a track, irrespective of what genre it is. I'm trying to go into a state of mind where I'm not pressured by anything and the outside world doesn't exist. Okay?
Wow.
Cool. So once you're in that little space, you generally find that things start to flow. You need to be sort of free from external distractions. I live by myself, so that's awesome. I've got no housemates to worry about sort of distracting me. My only distraction is myself. And really what that means is I'm able to sort of zone in and just focus on just trying to capture my own imagination and capture a vibe. Now, of course, at some point in the creative process, I'm going to run into something that maybe doesn't sound right. Okay, and this might happen very early on when I'm still trying to focus on just getting ideas down and sort of focusing on capturing some sort of vibe, a moment in time. If I start to stress about EQing a snare drum or sort of compressing something, or if I start to get drawn down some sort of technical rabbit hole, what Cleese hypothesizes is that actually pulls your brain out of that mode of operation and starts to actually activate a different part of the brain that works very, very differently, and he calls this closed mode. So after years of teaching and after years of exploring my own really messed up creative brain, which I still don't fully understand, but I'm getting better at it, I've really sort of had this greater awareness of how important it is to be able to control that switch between the sort of playful, non-stressed sort of open mode, which is where all your ideas are going to come from, but being able to switch back and forth between that and the analytical close mode at the touch of a button.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And that, to me, is the key of getting into this state of creative flow, is being able to decide if something doesn't sound right, do you leave it and just carry on, focus on just focus on getting the ideas down and that sort of creative flow state? Because there's always a danger that if you start to sort of think about that kick drum, EQ or whatever too much, that's actually going to completely pull you out of that creative flow state and you're going to end up becoming stressed out. And that's another thing that Cleese states, is that with that closed mode, this is also accompanied by various different psychological factors, such as anxiety. If you've got a pressing deadline, right, and you've got an essay due at 5 o'clock and you haven't started it yet, the stress of that impending deadline is actually going to shut your creative drive down because you're stressing, because you're in the state of anxiety. It actually forces you into this closed mode state. And I definitely find that for me, that having an understanding of that has made it easier to get stuff down and not let the technical side interfere with the creative process, right? But as you stated, you mix as you go. In the electronic realm, if you're making music in the box, you have to get really, really good at being able to do little things that start to address the mix down early on without getting sucked down an EQ, an EQing a snare drum rabbit hole, for example. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
So for me, there's certain things that I'm always focused on when I sit down and start producing a track. Number one, and this is exactly the same as it is for recording, the number one key to getting a good mix is the starting ingredients that you've got to work with, right? And this, unfortunately, is the hardest part about getting good at electronic music production, I think, is being able to identify what elements are actually going to work together, okay? So basically what I mean by that is that, for example, a massively overlooked aspect of electronic music production with producers that are just starting out is the absolute necessity of tuning kick drum and snare drum samples effectively, right? So that has a massive bearing on how the end result of the mix is going to turn out. Right?
By tuning, you mean the musical pitch?
Exactly.
To actually assign a musical note that then falls into the key of the song. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yes. So, for example, if I'm writing a key in the key of G minor, hardly ever write in major keys, so it's going to be minor keys. If I'm writing in G minor, the fundamental frequency of my bass line, for example, if I'm following the sort of root note of the key, would be just under 50 hertz, right? So if I've got a bass drum that's obviously sort of that's tuned to a slightly different frequency, that might actually cause musical dissonance between the bass line and the kick drum.
The pitch starts to rub.
Yeah, exactly. And you get this sort of beat frequency sort of strangeness that happens. Now, when I first started writing music, I wasn't really aware of this. And it was only ever done by intuition and feel. So often I could tell, hang on, that kick drum's not sitting right. Let's just play with the pitch, just go in and transpose it and see what happens. And then I noticed that at various different pitches, the kick drum would obviously now start to fit in the mix. And then obviously by learning more about music theory and this kind of stuff, I realized, hang on, there's an inherent relationship here.
Yeah, right.
And this is the key specifically for things like drum and bass production, where you've got such low-end management to take care of. You want to make sure that your kick and your bass line just don't interfere at all. The tuning actually goes a long way into ensuring that sort of the congruency or the cohesiveness of these elements.
Wow, that's good. I love what you just said. That's really, really good stuff. So that's important to consider. You know, I've come across this myself when I received mixes where somebody added a sine wave to the kick, you know, which is a typical sidechain, gated sidechain technique. Yeah. And if the sine wave is not in key, that's when the kick really becomes tonal. But depending on the nature of the kick, if it's a clicky one, I find that for me, it's really hard to hear a note or a pitch. It's the longer sustaining kick.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
It's the longer notes that, like an 808, that actually have a distinct tail.
Yes.
That's where the pitch develops, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're right, though. With shorter, sort of clickier kick drum samples or sounds, it might be difficult to discern that. Yeah. Really good tip. Pitch it up an octave, because often when you pitch it up an octave, it actually makes you more aware of that fundamental frequency.
Oh, and then it's easier
to pitch it. Yeah.
To realize whether it's in pitch or not.
Exactly.
I get it. And that would be a temporary step. So you temporarily pitch it up an octave, tune it, and then drop it an octave.
And then drop it back down an octave. So that's a practical tip that might come in useful for people.
It's a great tip. Yeah. I've never thought about this. That's fantastic.
Works really well on snare drums as well. Snare drums often would, for me, be tuned to either the fundamental, because obviously your kick drum and your snare, if they are tuned to the same frequency, they inherently do sit apart in the frequency spectrum. So it might not be as much of an issue. Definitely for bass drums, kick drums, that tuning is hugely important, as well as starting with the right sample. Yeah. A really good way to think about it is I'm really big into cooking. And one of my sort of earliest mentors was a Michelin star winning chef, and he was my sort of one of my earliest bosses. I used to work in his kitchen, and he taught me a lot about perfectionism. Actually, maybe that's where I get it from partially. But we used to talk about music production and how similar it was to cooking, and I think this is a really good example of that. Is that the ingredients that you start off with are all important in how tasty that meal is. You know, if you take a Michelin star winning chef who's going to cook anything really, really well, if you give them a bunch of bad, like sort of low quality ingredients, and give them a load of good quality ingredients, you would expect that the one with the better ingredients is going to taste nicer. And I think that's certainly the same for mixing and obviously choosing an ensemble to begin with. So for me, the source sound, being able to actually identify as a producer that this kick drum is the right one for the musical context, it's going to fit beautifully with the snare and the bass line, for example. Once it's been tuned, I think that's the key to getting a good mix for me.
Get it? So, right. So I'm very aware that the musical arrangement, is effectively the most powerful element of mixing in some situations,
yes.
and that actually means it goes all the way down to songwriting and arranging and finding the right instruments.
Absolutely.
And since you work in one DAW start to finish, even in the mix, if there's an oversight, let's say, you can go back and tune that, which is it's an ability that I don't always have when my clients give me their multitrack files to mix. That's really good.
Yeah,
excellent. And can you talk about your mixdown workflows in a bit more detail? So, look, if I use a compressor, there's usually something that makes me want to use it. I hear, let's say, let me pick a snare drum or a vocal. I hear that it's too loud in some sections and not loud enough in another.
Yeah.
And that gives me something to aim for. I grab a compressor and then I start working it until it sits better. But with most EDM signals, they're pretty much very well produced to start with, and often the dynamic range, or the level, is pretty steady.
Yes.
So there must be something else on your mind, but level changes when you pick a compressor, I assume. Can you shine some light on what's going on there?
Yeah, if you were to look at one of my mixdown sessions from 2021, for example, and compare that with a mixdown from, say, 2009 or 2010, obviously I've learned a lot in that time, you will notice that I'm hardly using anything in the way of any sort of severe compression or even in things like EQ. Recently I sort of showed some people one of my sessions and said look at what I'm putting on these tracks. You'll notice that there's not an awful lot of stuff actually going on here, and that, I guess, is because I prioritized the starting sound, that starting ingredient, and I've got better at identifying what that is. So it means that I have to EQ and compress stuff less. The biggest thing for me, though, and again, I think this is something that I go on about quite a lot. But for me, the key to the good mix, as well as obviously having the right starting ingredients and tuning them correctly and this kind of stuff, is level balancing. It really is the absolute key. And when I started to get better at that, I realized that I wasn't having to compress and EQ things anywhere near as much, because my perception of those elements was very different. If you can get the gain staging and the level balancing doing the majority of the mix sort of construction, I guess, you will often find that you don't really need an awful lot of heavy duty compression and post-processing, which to me, I wish someone had told me that when I first started out. But for me, it's all about level balancing, and there are certain things that I build into my actual compositional workflow, right? So when I sit down to write a track, the most important objective is getting the ideas down and coming up with something that is musically and aesthetically cohesive. So obviously having the right ingredients, and musically, and obviously the arrangement, as you've talked about, is also integral in getting a good mix. In fact, that's actually changed the way that I write bass lines, is having an understanding of the fact that often the arrangement can create more work for you down the line, right? For example, if you listen to a lot of early Third Eye stuff, within the dubstep genre, I was working a lot with a lot of elements from techno and house music, for example, like 4-to-the-floor kick drums, which you do hear in dubstep every now and again, although it is mainly known for its sort of different beat patterns, like the half-step pattern that you would associate with dubstep. When I was writing 4/4 stuff, I was often following the kick drum pattern with my bass line, which of course is going to create mixdown issues. If I've got a 50 hertz sub note hitting at the same time as a 50 hertz kick drum, then of course there's going to be separation, frequency masking issues that occur from that. So I simply stopped writing my bass lines in that way, and I stopped doing specific drum patterns, because I realized actually this was creating more work for me than I'd hoped for, essentially. So it also changed the way that I worked with different samples as well. So I was started to work with sort of higher pitched kick drums and this kind of stuff. So certainly the arrangement is hugely important in this too. But when I construct a track, usually what I will do is just focus on the level balancing. The key for that, for me personally, is getting my bass drum to hit around about minus 10 dB. Snare drum roughly around about the same, resulting in a sort of overall drum level of about minus 8 dB. Sub bass a little bit below that, and that is an approach that I follow every single time. It doesn't really change depending on genre. So if I'm balancing a metal mix, it will be roughly in the same ballpark. And what that means is by the time I've actually got my elements together, the mix is pretty much there. It's not really going to require an awful lot of corrective treatment, provided I've got the arrangement right, provided the samples are tuned correctly, and provided that I've started with the right samples to begin with.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's phenomenal. I just saw so many similarities between the way I work and you work there, and I had no idea that you were doing very similar things there. And that's quite interesting to see, because the work we do is so different in many ways.
Yes.
But also so similar.
Yeah, definitely.
That's fascinating.
Definitely. And for me, as if you can get that level balance right, you'll have a greater awareness of what potentially corrective treatments that you do need to apply. Yeah. And then anything like compression for me, usually compression would be applied in order to shape transients. So using the compressor to really sort of focus on bringing out the punch of things like kicks and snares, which is something that again I've really helped a lot of other producers with over the years of working with them, is observing what they're doing and giving them some tips and stuff on how they could actually sort of use their compressor in a different way to get the results that they want.
To shape the envelope of the signal.
Essentially shaping the envelope of your snare drums, using the compressor as an envelope controller, essentially. Yeah, cool. Which takes a bit of time to get your head around, and really important that you don't set your attack time too fast. This kind of thing, which is a very, very common mistake in producers. A lot of producers that I've observed working in Ableton, when they compress a snare drum, they slap the stock Ableton compressor on there and don't play with the attack time.
And it's then too short.
Which is then
too short. Transient on the head too hard.
So you're actually making the snare less punchy rather than too punchy, which is the way that I used to do it as well, until I started to sort of get my head around that I was kind of doing it backwards. So that to me is something I think is really important, is that if you can get that level balancing done as you go, it means that by the end of the composition process, the track should be more or less pretty much mixed. It also leaves room for corrective and creative processing. That's the way that I usually think about these things, is corrective stuff is usually things for me like using high pass filters to remove frequencies from things like hi-hats that are just taking up unnecessary headroom, frequencies that you can't even really hear but are certainly contributing to the overall clarity when it's a cumulative process. If you've got 10 different hi-hat tracks all working as part of your beat, if you don't high pass those, you might notice that cumulatively you get this slightly muddy quality that sort of bleeds into the drum mix. And if you can sort of build in that sort of high pass filtering, obviously not getting too heavy handed with it, which is something that happened to me over the years. I actually started to get way too aggressive in how I was sort of cutting off these lower frequencies. You can actually hear it if you listen to the earlier Third Eye stuff. A lot of my mid-range basses sound quite thin, and it's because I was sort of getting a little bit aggressive with the way that I was sort of creating the space with low cuts. So for me, it's all about just trying to find that happy medium now, and sort of erring on the side of caution and not getting too brutal. You need a little bit of that crossover bleed to sort of give you the thickness in the mix. So as part of my sort of composition process, two of those things are built in: high pass filters on anything that might need it straight away, and level balancing. And then anything from there is usually straightforward, provided that I've got the ingredients right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it all sounds like you've got a system worked out that makes mixing really easy for you.
Yeah.
And, you've got a workflow there. And I think that's what I find with all the successful producers that I talk to, that they all have their own system that works really well.
Yeah.
So you're not fighting an uphill battle when you mix. And that's a good headspace to be in as well.
It is, yeah. And again, within the sort of fields of electronic music that I'm involved in, mainly drum and bass and dubstep, we do talk about these things at parties. We do have these nerdy discussions about how you're doing things. And obviously you hang out in the studio and you get to see how people work. And a lot of, for example, drum and bass producers actually do mix very aggressively, right? It's not because they don't understand dynamics and headroom and gain structure, but it actually does contribute to that aesthetic, right? I'm a dynamic mixer. I've always liked space, and I don't really like heavily compressing things. I definitely have been through phases where I compressed everything way too much. But these days, it's all about, for me, preserving that natural dynamic that exists between the elements. When I work with other producers, often they're pushing things a lot harder, right? And in certain situations, that really works. You can actually, use things like soft clipping and
as an effect.
And as a way of shaping the aesthetic of the final mix. Another great sort of comparison is how I work versus, again, my friend Sapphire. He pushes things really, really hot, yeah? But it's a vital part of his sound. It's he's got this almost like alchemical control over it, to a point where it really sort of suits his aesthetic. Yeah, I work very differently, and there's no right or wrong as long as it works for the sound that you're going for, I guess. But I've always been into dynamics. That's my thing, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's some amazing wisdom, and I'm really fascinated by tapping into your mind and just starting to understand how you approach music, and I think it's phenomenal.
I've got another one for you,
Okay.
which I think could be beneficial for, again, anyone that's sort of getting into electronic production or anything like that, is the 5-minute rule. Do you know what that is?
No, explain.
All right, so the 5-minute rule, I can't take credit for this. I got this, again, from a guy called Il Gates, not Bill Gates, but Il Gates, who's an amazing producer from America. He's actually came over here and he's done a whole bunch of different workshops, all about sort of production mindset, this kind of thing. He's quite a big influence on me in terms of his philosophy on production, and he's a very, very, very smart guy. And it was him that introduced me to this concept of the 5-minute rule. So during that creative process, we've talked about you want to be in sort of open mode, you want to be in creative flow, you don't want to get caught up in the technical things as much as possible, right? So this is where the 5-minute rule comes in, right? And it's often hard to apply this because you get attached to elements within your production, right? I don't know what causes this, but sometimes, maybe it's ego or maybe it's something else, I don't know. Yeah. You go, this is the kick drum for this track, it has to be that one. Or, this is the bass sound for this particular track, I want this bass sound in the tune, right? Sometimes it's not meant to be, right? Sometimes after about 5 minutes, you find that you're still trying to get something to fit, right? So I'm talking about, for example, choosing the right snare drum for a drum and bass track, right? If after about 5 minutes of trying to get something to work, right, in the context of your production, whether that's with EQ or compression or tuning, if after about 5 minutes it's not yet working, this is when to execute the 5-minute rule. Can you guess what the 5-minute rule is?
You either have a break or you move on to something else. Your mind needs distraction, I guess.
Delete the sample and try a new one. Yeah, for example, right? Load a different bass patch. Yeah. Because if after 5 minutes something isn't sitting, it's usually a sign that it just wasn't meant to be. Yeah,
I see.
If that makes sense. Yeah, I guess this goes back to selecting your ingredients,
and it keeps you from digging too deep into a narrow element that, in the end, might not make a big difference.
Exactly.
It keeps you in a good productive flow moving forwards.
Yes,
and it keeps you. Yeah. I've explained this before as zooming in and out.
Yeah.
Whether this be a DAW session or a PDF document doesn't matter, but it's the same mental state where you can zoom in so far that you completely lose the entire perspective.
Yeah.
And that's not a good place to be in for too long, at least.
Totally.
And that's where the 5-minute rule makes perfect sense, to get you back out and to see the big picture again.
Yeah. It's easier to apply that rule if you're producing in the box rather than recording a band, because for example, if a drummer's snare drum isn't the right sound for the recording, they're going to have to go and get a new snare drum from somewhere, and you're going to have to re-record all the drums,
or tune it, or whatever. Or whatever. Yeah.
When you're working with samples and things like bass patches and
that's
stuff
really
like
quick,
that, you can just literally switch it out, and usually that's the answer, rather than sitting there for 5 hours and going, no, this snare drum, I'm going to saturate it, multi-band compress it, pitch it up, all this stuff. Usually that you'll get a better result just by just deleting it and trying a new sample, and often that new sample will fit straight away.
I really like this idea of keeping you on a fast, productive workflow. It won't allow you to overthink.
Yes.
And that's what it really does.
And that's the key for me.
That's the key.
Don't overthink.
Don't overthink and just keep going,
just
keep
going
the
forward.
And
the more you think, the more you're going to get pulled into that closed mode of operation. You're going to start to sweat about things like EQ, and then that pulls you out of that creative mode. And this is where you start hating the track, for example, or you start to get annoyed. You start to get this sort of niggly feeling. Yeah. So that to me is really helpful. It's just going,
a lot to take in, James. That's really fantastic wisdom that you're sharing here today. So thank you. That is amazing stuff. I need to go over this one more time in slow motion for myself and just, really ask myself whether I make any mistakes with this, because I now have a certain clarity that I didn't fully have before.
Well, that's
thank
good
you
to
so
hear.
much for
that's
sharing.
Good to hear. I'm glad that's useful. Yeah.
If anybody wants to find out more about you and your projects, where would people find out about you? Have you got a website or social media channels where people can find you?
Not really. I'm kind of stealthy. with things like that. I'm very lucky that most of my reach has been very organic, and I haven't really done a lot of sort of promotion of things over the years.
Okay.
The best place to keep up with the Third Eye project is on SoundCloud. I haven't really released much under that project name for quite a while, but there is definitely some new stuff coming. For my newer project, the collaborative project with my friend in the UK, I'm not yet allowed to say the name of it. That will hopefully have a bit more of sort of reach and stuff on social media via Bandcamp. So I will eventually have a Bandcamp link for you. And yeah, the best thing is to just sort of follow the SoundCloud pages for now. I do have a Facebook page, but I don't really engage with it that much.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can people reach out to you and book you as a producer or mix engineer for their own projects? Is that something you would consider?
At this stage, unfortunately not.
Okay.
And the reason for that is just I just don't have any time, because I've got so much music that I need to finish of my own at the moment, and projects that I need to get out there. So
I'm sure you would reconsider if it was Madonna or Daft Punk or somebody like
Deftones
that.
or something. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I do occasionally do stuff for clients. I do a bit of mastering here and there for a couple of artists, which is something that I'm just getting into now. But yeah, not really mixing stuff.
Okay, I understand. Look, whatever you're happy to share, I would like to add into the show notes so that there's some kind of point of contact where people can listen to your music and find out more about you.
No problem.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge so openly. That's eye-opening shit. I love it.
Awesome.
I love it.
Anytime, mate.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. And as I said, like as one that struggled a lot with that overthinking and that sort of getting sucked into the psychological abyss of self-doubt and perfectionism, I really hope the tips that I've given will help other people avoid that that situation, because it can get pretty soul destroying at times. And I think someone like myself who's been through a lot of sort of self-confidence issues and really to an extent has learnt the hard way, I think that's one of the reasons why I love sharing this stuff, is because hopefully it will sort of give people a bit more confidence to keep pushing through and just realize that things like self-doubt and perfectionism are totally normal. Everyone gets it. If you were to speak to your top producers and ask them,
just go through past episodes of this podcast.
There you
Everybody
go.
shares their own little slice of that.
There you go. Yeah.
Of course, we all have that in us.
That's it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Pleasure. Awesome. Thanks,
Cheers.
Jan. Cheers.
Wow, and as we get into the outro of this episode, you probably noticed that I've changed the background music of my podcast today. What you're listening to is some royalty-free music that James Lyall released under his artist name Third Eye, and he was so kind to supply us with some WAV files, which I'm now playing in the background. So enjoy James's work in the outro of this episode. Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate what you shared with us today. This is absolute gold, and I want all of you listeners to please recommend this episode to all your friends. Just think about it. I'm sure you know somebody, or probably many people, who would benefit from what James shared with us today. So please pass it on, share the wisdom, and pass this podcast episode on to your friends. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can do so via my website, mixartist.com.au. If you need any help finishing your projects, then it's definitely worth reaching out and having a chat about it. And you can also meet me in the Production Talk podcast community Facebook page. I'll hang out there every week, and you can meet like-minded people. Okay, there was a lot to take in today. Let it sink in, share the love, share the wisdom, and I hope to speak to you again next week. So tune back in for another episode. Till then, bye for now.